So thank you, Donna, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you, Charter Oak family, for inviting me and having me here. Um, it's an honor and a pleasure to be here with you. So I'm going to talk about reframing Reconstruction, and I'm going to start off by suggesting that um, the way that we study history is probably a little different than the way history probably occurred. But let me start off by saying the following. Um, this is the 250th anniversary of the United States, and we are celebrating the American experience. And it's a wonderful thing to be in America and be able to look backwards. And one of the great things about America and being able to look backwards, which I was saying to Donna earlier, is that we have the privilege in this country to look back and see things that other people are not able to do with their countries in terms of looking at history. And usually in America, when we look back at greatness and then we move forward. But this year, I think, is going to be a little different. We're going to be able to look backwards and we're going to look at some of the critical flaws of the new republic. And this will lead us to look at some aspects of the past that are important. And probably because we're going to get into this period, 250 years going backwards, we're going to realize, as most historians do, that slavery was a problem. And slavery was a problem from 1776 to 1876 and moving up into the present time period. That the founding fathers realized that slavery was a problem, but they believed that future leaders would address it. And they believed that these future leaders, particularly presidents and members of Congress, were going to, live up to their billing and do things. However, the future leaders, including presidents, were also slave owners, and they also feared the economic calamities that would happen if they decided to do something with slavery. So as a result, slavery ended up taking over America mentally and physically. And we created a nation that was half free and half enslaved. And this is partly, if not solely, the major cause of the Civil War. But the Civil War, for most of us, was fought against the backdrop of technological advances and labor struggles. And so, depending on where you grew up in the United States, depending on how old you are, you learned the Civil War differently. And the Civil War could have been taught to you uh, as part of a labor struggle, could have been taught to you as part of a technological struggle, could have been taught to you as part of a social struggle. Most of those struggles did not center slavery. As an African American historian, um, and as a person who has studied the African American experience, we like to center slavery in the middle of that struggle and say that these things are important, but slavery really is the cause of the Civil War. So when you're thinking about all the other things, slavery is the centerpiece. And so you cannot escape slavery. But you can also see how slavery affects those other things. The development, for example, of the National Railroad is framed by slavery. So we would have had a national railroad before 1876 if it weren't for slavery. We would have had probably the right for women to vote before 1876 if it weren't for slavery. So there are a lot of things that you can look at and focus on. But today I'm going to suggest to you that we have to reframe slavery, we have to reframe Reconstruction if we are going to look at this period um, and really understand the 250th anniversary of the United States. So I'm going to be a bad historian today, and I'm going to contest what you probably believe and what you probably have been taught in schools. And I think that's my mission. Um, as a teacher, as an instructor, as a college professor, I'm supposed to get the public to think about history in a different way. And so I'm going to try to get you to think deeply about this time period. And I'm going to suggest to you that Reconstruction is really another American Revolution. It's not that 1776 to 1881 is the only American Revolution, but that this is also an American Revolution, and that we might be in the process of a third American Revolution, and we might not even recognize it yet. But that our grandchildren or great-grandchildren might say one day, wow, our parents or grandparents lived during this American Revolution. But this American Revolution is an unfinished one. And it's a philosophical one as well as a physical one. It's the pledge of liberty and justice that is universal, not just created for the former enslaved people. And by the conclusion of this presentation, I hope to offer another reason why Reconstruction fails and why we need to re-examine the past to enjoy another 250 years. Okay. So let's get to the Civil War. The Civil War is the first photographed war in American history and one of the first photographed wars in the history of the world. There are over 30,000 pictures. Most of them, though, are images of charging lines, wounded soldiers, resting troops, and tons of weapons. An estimated 600 to 750,000 people died during the war. Many of them died of disease rather than of battle injuries. And so the war highlights the divisions of the nation, including industrialization and immigration that was transforming the North. So now I'm going to give you some statistics, and I'm going to suggest the Civil War had three sides, not two, as most people suggest. So the first side is the Union, and the Union are the northern states, Maine, New York, New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Kansas, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, California, Nevada, and Oregon. And Abraham Lincoln, of course, was their president. And then there's the Confederacy. And you have to keep in mind that when we study the Confederacy, you live in Connecticut for the most part. The Confederacy is not just a rebel territory. When you're in the South, you study the Confederacy as the CSA, which is the Confederate States of America, an independent country. The Confederate States of America were formed in 1861 when these states seceded from the Union. They formed their own nation. They had their own president, vice president, and Senate, and they had a capital in Richmond. So the Confederacy includes the states of Texas, Arkansas, Louisiana, Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Florida, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia. And Jefferson Davis was their president. And then there were the in-between places, and those were referred to as the border states. The border states are Maryland, Delaware, West Virginia, which breaks off from Virginia, Kentucky, and Missouri. And why is this important? Because you have three different entities during this war. The population of the Union was about 18.5 million. The Confederacy was about 5.5 million free and about 3.5 million enslaved. In the border states, there were about 2.5 million free, that's including white and black, and about 500,000 enslaved. In terms of money, which is the important element during this war, the Union had roughly $234 billion in bank receipts, and the Confederacy had somewhere in the vicinity of $74 billion. So that's right, yeah. And then the border states had about 29. So this is where we get tricky. And I just wanted to share this with you because it's important to recognize. There are a lot of soldiers fighting in this war. There are over 1 million people fighting in the war. The numbers of people captured, though, are different. If you look at the first set of statistics, it suggests that about 16,000 Union soldiers were captured and paroled on the field, and about 30,000 died on the field. I'm sorry, died in prison. And then 247,000 Confederates were paroled on the field, and about 25,000 died in prison. The death toll is usually given as a total number, but if you look and you see the number of casualties, you can see that the casualties are greater for the Union, over 600,000, and for the Confederacy, 483,000. And there were several battles that were considered to be very bloody battles where thousands of people died in either a day or several days. And so I've listed those as Gettysburg, 7 days, Chickamauga, Chancellorsville, and Antietam. So you can see that as well. Okay. All right. If you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat or raise your hand, and I'll be happy to stop and answer them as well. So in 1864, the Union had not yet won the war, and the Union was in a very shaky place. Abraham Lincoln had basically decided that he was going to try to do something to give the Union an edge in the conflict. And so in 1862, he started this movement, which most Union historians argue was supposed to change the tide of the war, but it didn't actually take effect until late in 1864. But I think I need to go back and define it for you. So in 1862, Abraham Lincoln decided that he was going to try something because his troops had been rattled in the early battles of the war. So he decided that he was going to use presidential powers that had never been used before to challenge the context of the war. And the first thing he decided to do was he refused to accept that the Confederacy was a separate or independent nation. So he'd never recognized the CSA as an independent nation. And by doing so, then he was able to do what presidents do now, which is make independent statements and have presidential decrees. And so the first thing he did was he declared that slavery was going to be illegal in Washington, D.C. And then he allowed for slave owners in Washington, D.C. to be compensated for their slaves. So they would lose their slaves if they stayed in Washington, but they would be compensated. And then he outlawed slavery in Washington, D.C. And this was the introduction of what we call emancipation. And then in the summer of 1862, he announced that he had the power as president to free slaves in the territories. So places that were not states, he said, now they will be set free because he can use his presidential powers. What's important about this is that no one was actually set free because no one was liberating these people who were enslaved. But by saying this, he hoped to infuriate the Confederacy, and he also hoped that when Union troops reached these areas, they would actually free people, and that the enslaved would actually free themselves. In September of 1862, Lincoln then made a statement saying that if the war continued, on January 1st, 1863, he was going to make a grand announcement, which was going to be known as the Emancipation Proclamation. And on January 1st, 1863, if the war continued, he was going to make a statement that freed all slaves who were in areas that were occupied by the Confederacy. Now, this is tricky because most of us probably have learned that in elementary school and maybe even as late as high school, that on January 1st, 1863, Lincoln came forward, he read this Emancipation Proclamation, and that the slaves were set free. Now, what's important about it is, if you remember my previous slide, I showed you the border states. The border states had slaves. The Confederate States had slaves. The only people who could have technically been set free on January 1st, 1863, are the people who held slaves in areas that belonged to the Confederacy. So no one in the border states was set free, and only people in the Confederate States of America were set free if Union troops were there to give them their freedom. So technically, no one was set free on January 1st, 1863. However, Lincoln believed that this was going to help him. So by 1864, Lincoln was hopeful that as Union troops had started to move southward and moved into places like Kentucky and Tennessee and North Carolina and parts of Virginia and even parts of Louisiana, that his Emancipation Proclamation would set people free. And so it was dreamed and it was hoped then that this would be the liberating factor. In some cases, it worked. In other cases, it did not work. But if you remember the previous slide, lots of Union troops were dying. Lots of Union troops had been captured. And so there was a presidential election in 1864. Again, if you study Confederate history tells you a lot of unique things. The Confederates, and this is why it's an American Revolution, the Confederates decided that even though they had created a new nation, they were not going to base it on the same factors that had been used in creating the United States. And one of the key things was they decided to have a presidency, and the president could not be reelected. The president could only have a 6-year term. So the president of the Confederacy was not worried about being reelected, and his term was only in the midpoint in 1864. This was strategic because most of the Confederates who had become officers in the Confederacy were members of the United States Senate and the Congress, and they knew that Lincoln was going to face an election in 1864. And they knew that Lincoln had just barely survived getting elected in the first place in 1861. And so they recognized that he was going to have a rough time getting reelected, given the number of casualties and given the challenges that he faced by making these concessions and by freeing slaves. And so the Democrats realized that they had an advantage when they compared themselves to the Republicans. And so the Democrats decided that in 1864, the answer was not to defeat the Confederacy, but to demand a truce. And so the Democrats said, let's have a truce. Let's not continue the war. Let's have a truce right now, and we will end the fighting. The Republicans, on the other hand, they felt that they needed to keep fighting and they needed to have a victory. And they needed to punish the Confederates for breaking away from the nation. And so the key of the war then was really the politics. It wasn't just the number of people who were dying. It was what would happen when the war was over. What would the Democrats offer to the South? What would the Republicans offer to the South? And what would the Confederates want in return to stop fighting? And so the problem is that the Republicans really didn't have a lot of concessions that they wanted to make. The Republicans really wanted to punish the South. They wanted to come in and say, we are sick of you. You created this war. You've killed a lot of people. You've destroyed a lot of the countryside. We need to just punish you. We need to put you in jail. We need to, make you pay for the war. The Democrats are saying, no, they're all Americans. We need to offer them something. The Southerners were afraid that if they agreed to anything, their way of life would be over. They believed that there would be miscegenation, where there would be unification between blacks and whites, that slavery would come to an end in some form, if not completely, and therefore they had to decide, what should they do? Should they join with the Democrats and push for the truce, or should they keep fighting and hopefully defeat the Republican viewpoint? And so the Confederates then reached out to England and France to see if they could get them to recognize the Confederacy as a separate country so that they could declare their independence and not have to join with the Democrats or the Republicans, and hope that the French or the British would recognize them, and that they could have a peace treaty where they could have a border separating the South from the North and have two separate countries. So this is a slide in September 1864, which is a cartoon showing the compromise with the South. And if you look at it carefully, the figure on the right is a Confederate, and he's standing on the grave of a Union soldier, and his sword is, you see below, his sword is broken. And this woman is Miss Columbia, who was the symbol of America, and she's crying. The person who the Confederate soldier is shaking hands with is a Union soldier, and you can see that he's missing a limb. And it represents the fact that the North has lost so much in the war, but yet they are willing to compromise because the Democrats are suggesting that it's in their best interest to compromise. So if you look up top, you can see the flags, and you can see that the American flag is upside down, and you can see that the Confederate flag is standing upright. And so the political cartoon is suggesting that when the Democrats went to their convention in Chicago, that they were kowtowing to the Confederacy, and that the Confederacy, if there was a compromise, were going to be the beneficiaries of this compromise. So Lincoln was in a challenged position. He was being challenged by General Fremont, who had been the Republican nominee in 1856. And this is another political cartoon where it's suggesting that the Democratic candidate could use his wife as a lure to get votes. So Lincoln is put in a bad position. And so this is another one of these political cartoons. Again, you have the image of America with Miss Columbia. And then this is the image of America, but this is not Uncle Sam. This is Brother Jonathan. Brother Jonathan comes before Uncle Sam. And in this case, he's Dr. Jonathan as opposed to Brother Jonathan, because they're asking what's the problem with him, because you can see the character is shrunken, and the character is supposed to be Lincoln. And you can see that the small Lincoln is holding a black doll, right? And it's suggesting that she says, "Tell me, doctor, what's the matter with him? Do you think his brain is affected?" And then Brother Jonathan, in this case, Dr. Jonathan says, "Oh no, my dear madame, it's only an aggravated case of a sore head. And so you can see that the Republicans are dissatisfied with Lincoln's pace, right? And that they're also frustrated with Fremont. And so this is about the whole issue of what's going to happen in America. Is Lincoln going to move forward and take over? Is Fremont going to, move over and push the Republicans ahead? And no one seemed to know what was going to happen. However, Fremont does drop out of the race. Um, and then Lincoln's going to be challenged by Union General McClellan in the election of 1864. But here's the other part of the problem. Lincoln eventually recognizes he cannot run as a Republican in 1864 and win. And so Lincoln has to do something that was not considered at the time. And so what Lincoln decides to do is he forms a fusion party, which becomes known as the Union Party. And the Union Party includes Democrats and includes some of the Southern Democrats on the ticket with him, so that it seems that he's appealing to some of the aspects of a compromise as well to bring everyone together. So here we have one of the first political cartoons where we have the elephant, and it's saying, "Rally around the flag, boys, rally once again, shouting the battle cry of freedom." And this is an argument saying that they should keep fighting. And then this cartoon is a really interesting one because it's the train to the White House, and you can see the White House in the upper left-hand corner, which I think is important. And then you can see the storyline where the abolitionists are at the bottom, and the abolitionist crusade is getting thwarted. The king is also at the left-hand side, and he's talking to somebody. And you can see that people, the politicians are all on the train that's being sort of hijacked. And so the Union train is trying to get to the White House, which is the Union Party. And it's suggesting that abolitionism isn't going to work the way it's supposed to work. So there's a lot of contention going on. So you have this political contention going on while you're trying to win the war, and it's not clear what's going to happen. But you can see that there's, a lot of debt, there's a lot of fighting, there are a lot of different political parties, and a lot of infrastructure fighting between them. And then this is the fear. This is the miscegenation picture, which is the fear of what would happen if the Union wins the war and if slavery is abolished. And so this is the use of the term miscegenation. And so you see Lincoln is all the way at the left, and then these are other politicians with black women, and then there are also a few white women with black men. So the fear is very visible and great. And then this is another image of the two parties running in 1864. So Baltimore is the Union ticket, and Chicago is the Democratic ticket with McClellan. And the little person is McClellan. They're calling him Little Mac. And then that's Lincoln on the other side. And then Lincoln is with the Eagle and also with Miss Columbia. And then this image is McClellan, where McClellan is making a deal allegedly with the Confederates and with the Democrats, so that as the Republican candidate, he is going to then combined forces of the Democrats and the Republicans together to defeat Lincoln. And you see that McClellan, again, is described as Little Mac, and the devil is on his back. And I think what's so interesting about these political cartoons is that we don't usually think of the vitriol that comes with this time period, but it's filled with vitriol and filled with anger and resentment. This is a another political cartoon which is suggesting that um, the Irish are not in favor of emancipation either. And so this is about riots, and these characters that are in the center of the picture are supposed to be the representation of the Irish, and they're supposed to be lynching and stringing up blacks and stopping them from getting freedom. And so what it says is, what we want, be jabbers, is peace and liberty. And then the war is continuing, moving into 1865. The Union is winning more battles. It's starting to look like the Union is going to win because the South is basically running out of weapons. And so this is a British cartoon depicting Lincoln as someone who was willing to kill for no reason. And he's with Miss Columbia, and you see he's holding a knife in his hand, and he looks angry, and it's saying, I think it's saying something liberty. Okay. This is one of my favorite pictures because there's a lot to figure out in this picture. So this is Lincoln entering Richmond on April 4th, 1865. And this is when it was believed that the North had won the war. So this is actually 10 days before Lincoln, 11 days before Lincoln's going to die. But the South has allegedly, this is what we learn in school, which is not true. And I'll get to that in a second. But most of us learned that General Lee surrendered and the war was over. And so that was critical. So Lincoln then, knowing that General Lee surrendered, went to Virginia, and he went to Richmond because Richmond was the capital of the Confederacy. So this is an image of Lincoln coming into Richmond to acknowledge the fact that the Confederacy seems to be crushed. And so it's the spiritual idea that Lincoln is coming in to signify to people that the Union has won and that he is here to put the nation back together. So on one hand, in the picture, you see the Union troops who were supposedly protecting Lincoln. You see Lincoln holding on to his son, or his son holding on to him. His son is on the left-hand side. And then you see large numbers of African Americans very happy to see Lincoln. You see the woman holding up her daughter, sort of like waiting for Lincoln to kiss the child. On the other hand, on the right-hand side, you see the woman holding Lincoln's hand and kissing Lincoln's hand, and then has a child in her arms that she wants Lincoln to acknowledge. And people are very excited that Lincoln is coming into Richmond to celebrate the end of the war. So what I'm asking you is to study this picture, because this picture is used to suggest that the war is over. We know on the 15th of April, Lincoln will be back in DC at Ford's Theater and will be shot by James Wilkes Booth. And what's important about that is that if the war had actually ended, Lincoln would have not been shot. Okay, so this is our checkpoint for 1865. Lincoln is thinking that the war is coming to an end. He offers his idea of Reconstruction. He suggests that we are going to end slavery without compensation to the owners, which is going to be an economic calamity. The Confederacy, realizing that slavery is going to fall in Virginia, suggests the use of blacks, both free and slaves, to fight in the war. And so they mobilized black troops in Mississippi and Alabama. And in many parts of the South, they start to recognize that it might be over. But when Lincoln is killed, there are still troops in the South, in North Carolina, in parts of South Carolina, in parts of Georgia, in Florida, in Texas, in Oklahoma, and in parts of Missouri. So then, what is Reconstruction? And why is Reconstruction so important? And so I give you two definitions to look at to understand what Reconstruction could be. So Reconstruction is supposed to be the rebuilding of the United States following the Civil War. But on whose terms? Should it be the Confederacy? Should the Confederacy decide? Should it be the Union who decides? And if it's the Union, should it be the Republicans? Should it be the Democrats? Should it be Congress? Should it be the president? And what was going to happen to the free blacks now in the South? And so we know that during this period, there are several Reconstruction plans. There's the plan offered by Lincoln, which is basically a 10-day plan because he's killed before anything really happens with his plan. There's the plan by Andrew Johnson, who was the vice president on the Union ticket. And Johnson is a Democrat. He's from the South. He's from Tennessee. As part of this fusion ticket, there's also a congressional Reconstruction. And then there is radical Reconstruction, which is usually referred to as the Republicans' radical Reconstruction. And so historians have disagreed about this since 1867 up until the present. So what we've all learned together is that several things have happened during Reconstruction. We have the 13th Amendment, which abolishes slavery. We have the 14th Amendment, which grants citizenship, and the 15th Amendment, which gives Black males the right to vote. We have the development and passage of the Freedmen's Bureau, and we have the passage of 3 Civil Rights Acts. And that's all that we agree upon. Everything else is up for debate. The other part of the story is what happens in the South. So several of my mentors talk about the rise of the New South. And they suggest that because the South is destroyed, the South has to be rebuilt. How is it rebuilt? What does it look like? And there are different stories that go along with this idea. There's also the mischaracterization of Andrew Johnson as president. There's also the mischaracterization of the Republicans, basically the radical Republicans. And then there's the mischaracterization of the military districts that take over the South that stay in place until roughly 1877. Okay. So I'm going to sort of zip through this so I can get to your questions because I don't want to talk too long. But what happens? So we know that President Johnson is disliked by virtually everybody. He doesn't like slavery. He also doesn't like Black people. He tries to allow the former Confederates back into the Union with limited penalties. The Republicans want to punish the South. They try to create amendments and laws that would punish the South. And that's how we got the military districts, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, the Freedmen's Bureau Bill, and the first Civil Rights Bill. President Johnson vetoed every piece of legislation that was passed during his term, but it was overridden by the Republicans because they were basically the only ones in power. The Freedmen's Bureau Bill was eventually defeated, and the first Civil Rights Bill was defeated as well. And in response to his actions, Congress impeached the president, and he survived it only by 1 vote. And this is the first time in American history that a president had been impeached. And then the Southerners who got back in power passed what were known as the Black Codes and the vagrancy laws. And this started to limit the mobility and access of Blacks, which leads to the Jim Crow era. There's lots of violence in the South. There's violence against Blacks. There's violence against poor whites. There's violence against whites who travel from the South, I mean, from the North to the South, who are usually referred to as carpetbaggers. There are whites in the South who support Blacks and support the Reconstruction rule. They are referred to as scalawags. Um, the church, the Black church, starts to grow in the South. It organizes schools, it organizes colleges, and it tries to push the idea of Black Reconstruction, which supports the ideas of Blacks to vote. Blacks are elected to Congress between 1867 and 1901. And Blacks are elected to the House, they're elected to the Senate, they become sheriffs, and they gain seats in state legislatures. And then laws are going to be passed to basically re-enslave Blacks, and it's going to be a back and forth type of scenario. It leads to segregation. Most of the segregation in the United States that we live with today comes out of this time period. Herbert Gutman, who was one of my mentors, uh, was one of the first people to sort of highlight the differences between white and Black society that come out of this time period. So just to give you an example, before the Civil War, the majority of barbers in the United States were Black men. After the Civil War, white men refused to pay Black men to cut their hair. And so white men became barbers. And then white men cut the hair of white people, and Black men cut the hair of Black people. Same thing was true with beauticians. Burial services, for the most part, wherever there were Blacks, Blacks buried everybody. After the war, there were separate burial services for whites and Blacks. The cemeteries in the United States became highly segregated after the Civil War. Stores became segregated after the Civil War. Stores became segregated after the Civil War. And this allowed for a creation of a Black middle class. Black people who would have never been wealthy became wealthy now because they were the barbers for every Black person in their town. They were the ministers for every Black person in their community. They were the doctors for every Black person in their community. So suddenly they had a community clientele which would have never gone to them. And now you have a Black middle class. It also created Black leadership. And a lot of the former slaves became Black spokesmen. The women's movement, for example, was transformed. Remember, the women's movement, starting in Seneca Falls in 1848, had advocated for Black male suffrage. They didn't gain it for themselves, so eventually they started to distance themselves from promoting the idea of Black equality. But the suffrage movement took on different stances and went in completely different directions. And so the women's suffrage movement generated interest because of its desire to support abolition, but it grew as a result of being against the fact that they did not get equality. And so everything happens because of slavery. And this is what I'm trying to suggest, is that the failure of the government to make Reconstruction that promise of equality and universal equality created a distinctly unique American country that focused on segregation and focused on difference and created an entirely different environment, which led to completely different directions. And so when you talk about the other things that emerge in America, you have to look at, let's say, for example, what happens with Asian Americans. And so when we have the Chinese Exclusion Act or the Page Act, which leads to the Chinese Exclusion Act, that happens in 1875 when we say that we don't want to let Asian women come into the United States anymore. When we get to the Chinese Exclusion Act, which is in 1882, that's happening at the tail end of Reconstruction. But the Chinese become pivotal in the United States because by 1876, the railroads in the United States are finished. The Transcontinental Railroad is finished. And so there is nothing for the Chinese to do anymore. And so Southerners decide that they want the Chinese to do something. They have the perfect job for them. They want them to replace the former slaves. And so Chinese are recruited to go to Mississippi and Alabama and replace the slave population. And they are willing to underpay them to come to their southern states to replace the slaves. But the Chinese are not good at picking cotton. And the Chinese eventually decide this is not for us. But the Chinese stay in Mississippi and Alabama and they become grocers and they develop a whole another industry in those states. In the West, the Chinese become miners. And so the Exclusion Act is really because the Chinese are forced into new industries, and those industries then affect white workers and affect labor in the United States, and then transform labor to the point where white workers are like, oh my gosh, these people are going to take our jobs. We need to get rid of them. We need to stop them from coming to the United States. And within a decade, they also recognize that the Japanese are going to do the same thing. And they want the gentleman's agreement to stop the Japanese from coming into the United States because they're going to take their jobs as well. So what I'm suggesting is that all these things go hand in hand, and we usually don't study them as a combination of events. We study them in isolation. And this changes the way in which women function in America as well. That the evolution of women in America would have been much more rapid, right? That when we talk about the evolution of women working and we talk about the girls working in factories in Lowell, that's affected by the Civil War. And then that's retarded by the Civil War. And then when women want to work again, it's like, no, you can't work. But women are now saying, we want to work and we want our rights. And they're like, no, we can't give you your rights because if we give you your rights, then blacks will want their rights too. So no, you can't get your rights. So all these things are connected. And that's what's really important about this. And that's why you have to have another American Revolution, because the idea of universal equality that has been promoted by the first American Revolution has been stymied. And so then you need another revolution, which is the civil rights movement, which brings all these forces together to say, we need women's rights, we need rights of minorities, we need workers' rights, we need, transformation of labor. And that's why all these people come together, because they were all formed from the struggles of what happened with the abolition of slavery. And that's what I'm trying to get you to think about, is that one movement can have a cataclysmic effect for the whole nation. So if you look at all these plans, what's important, and what I was saying earlier to Donna, is that we looked at how the Congress, at least one member of Congress or one population of Congress, the radical Republicans, really seemed like they were interested in transforming America. But the rest of Congress was not interested in transforming America because they wanted to maintain the status quo. They recognized that by having the military districts in the South, it allowed for the Industrial Revolution to continue its pace in the North, but it retarded the progress in the South. Northern congressmen became wealthy because they were able to invest in the railroads and the industries that were going to grow in the North. The South basically suffered as a process of the Civil War. And so we had the Republicans stay in power for a generation, holding on to the presidency because they would not let the South grow. The South then realized that the only way to get back into power was to use blacks as a weapon against the North. And so what did they do? They stopped blacks from voting because they recognized if they stopped blacks from voting, they could run for office unopposed and they could get back into power. And once the South gets back to its full strength, the South becomes solidly Democratic and they start electing Democrats in every major national campaign. And that leads up until the present time as well, right? So that when we go from the Reconstruction era all the way to 1948, the South was voting heavily Democratic because those are the Dixiecrats. Those are the people who revolted against the radical Republicans and said, we are not letting these people, get over on us ever again. And so what the civil rights movement does, what happens is that the civil rights movement has to destroy the Republican hold on the South. And in destroying the Republican hold on the South, the movement then leads to change. And what we're witnessing now is that clearly the Republican Party has to reinvent itself. And it reinvents itself when the Democratic Party has to reinvent itself because of Brown versus Board of Education. So what I'm trying to suggest is that there are cycles and that you see these cycles keep appearing over and over again because it's about the aspirations. So when I was saying to Donna earlier, it's that when we look at American exceptionalism, and I'm not trying to discount that, but I'm saying that American exceptionalism is really not what we think it is. We have people who are really interested in the goodness of America and the goodness of our society. But when they make changes, if those changes are not wholesale, it leads to problems. And they are not necessarily thinking of wholesale changes because they are looking at how to balance one group against the other. And so what happens is that you end up with political violence, you end up with social violence, you end up with depressions, you end up with recessions, and you end up with wars as an escape for the types of situations that develop. So how does this take us back to Reconstruction? Reconstruction then suggests that what are we going to do with this Black population? How can this Black population help us? What is this Black population going to do? Meanwhile, the Black population wants agency. The Black population wants to be able to vote and they want citizenship. And they are arguing for rights which the South doesn't want them to have. And so there is a idea of inequality that exists in the South, and this inequality is going to be important. And so this is why I'm going to share these next few slides. This is what Andrew Johnson said in 1866. He said, "This is the country for white men, and by God, as long as I'm president, it'll be a government for white men." And then same year, he said, everyone would and must admit that the white race was superior to the Black. And while we ought to do our best to bring them up to our present level, that in doing so, we should at the same time raise our own intellectual status so that the relative position of the two races would be the same. Okay. So even when he's saying that, he's not going to support equality, and that's why you're going to have Black codes. And so we have Black codes, and Black codes impose taxes on Blacks. It passes laws that stop blacks from doing things. They can't own guns. They had their dogs taxed. They had their houses taxed. Some cases they weren't allowed to hunt or fish in some areas. They were barred from orphanages, parks, schools, and other public facilities. In many towns across the nation, blacks could not swim in swimming pools. They could not go to ice skating rinks. They could not use parks. And this is an example. This is another political cartoon. And so the man on the right, his hat says ex-CSA, Confederate States of America. And then his piece of paper on the ground says no vote because he was stopped from voting. And then you have a picture on the right, I mean on the left, of a black man, and he has a piece of paper that says a vote. Okay. And he was able to vote because he served in the army. And Lincoln's promise was if you served in the army, you could vote. And so the question was, we accept the situation, but do we accept the situation? Because we don't. Okay. So historian Rayford Logan suggested that this period should be called the nadir, or the betrayal of the Negroes. He said it was the darkest period in African American history because the government did not help blacks, and they quickly lost interest in defending the rights that they had given the blacks. He suggested that blacks were left to fend for themselves. And so he goes on and he suggests that outside of the passage of the 15th Amendment, nothing would be helped to allow blacks to vote. And outside of the 14th Amendment, there would be nothing used to give blacks their full citizenship. Okay. The election of 1876 is the Great Compromise that everyone studies, which is the most compromised and contested election in the history of the United States. It's between the Republican Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel Tilden. They're both in the North. Tilden's from New York. Hayes from Ohio. When the election was over, Tilden was declared the winner. However, the Republicans, and this always makes me think of the election of 2000, the Republicans claimed there were disputed votes in Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina. All right. And the election went to the House of Representatives for a decision, and Hayes was declared the winner. Now, how did Hayes get to be declared the winner? Because the votes in those southern states were declared bogus, basically, and they were thrown out. But in order to secure the victory, Hayes and the Republicans made a deal, which is referred to as a compromise of 1877, and this allowed for the deal for the removal of all troops from the South and placing the hands of the former Confederates back into power. And this brings on what we refer to as the Jim Crow era. And that introduces the convict lease system. So I'm skipping through that, and also brings on forced labor. And as a result, we start having the end of the Civil Rights Acts and the end of the Ku Klux Klan laws, which leads us to this slide, which people say is also the key of Reconstruction, which is saying worse than slavery. And on one hand, you have the Ku Klux Klan, and on the other hand, you have the White League, and then you have these Black people in the center cowering with the schoolhouse. And then it says up top, the Union as it was. This is a white man's government. Okay. And so I'm just offering this slide in case you don't know that there's a difference between the Ku Klux Klan and the Knights of the White Camellia. I'm sure you do know that though, right? That there are two different organizations. The Knights of the White Camellia are basically an upper class group that was formed in Louisiana. And the Ku Klux Klan was formed in Tennessee and Kentucky. And they are sort of a lower class group that has similar patterns, but most people recognize the Ku Klux Klan because there are more people in that time period. And then lynching takes off during this time period. Lynching goes back to the American Revolution, which is referred to as Charles Lynch, but it spikes after 1877. And between 1877 and 1950, More than 4,000 African Americans are lynched during this period. And the only uh, non-blacks that are lynched in this period are Italians and Jews. And that's important to recognize too. And it's just, I'll share with you some of the photographs because when people were lynched, they were always photographed. And people also stood at the lynchings and then they were made into postcards. They were photographed, they were made into postcards, and then they were sent all across the country. And then eventually they used the lynching photographs and then they made postcards of them and changed the spectators into animals. I can skip this stuff. Okay. So let me get here. Okay. So the end of this period, roughly the turn of the century, led to the formation of race men and race women. And these people were supposed to be the Black leaders who would address the needs of the community. Um, and it's important to understand what were the role of Black women after the Civil War, what was their place in the household, the community, and public. And many organizations were formed. The most popular of these was the Afro-American Women's Club movement. It began to expand, and it argued against the Jim Crow laws, and it argued for suffrage with white women. Um, and it also challenged the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Um, in court cases, and it also challenged it when Homo Plessy refused to move from the streetcar in 1892, which led to the court case of Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. So I've sort of suggested what my logic conclusion is that the American Revolution offered this idea of universal equality. It was the first time that any nation had ever proposed such a concept, and that our view of the American Republic is hailed as a democracy. But our democracy did not materialize in 1776. In 1776, most people were disenfranchised, and at best, America was a representative democracy. Yet, for most of us, the belief of a universal equality was promoted continually by the images of Miss Columbia, of Brother Jonathan, then Uncle Sam, and then the eagle. African Americans were constantly offered this promise of freedom, starting with their involvement in the American Revolution. It was offered during the War of 1812 and then during the Civil War. Yet, for most African Americans, freedom was never universal equality. Oops, sorry. As a result, there are two different interpretations, at least two different interpretations of this period. There's an interpretation that African Americans were tricked into participating and helping whites for something that wasn't forthcoming, and that only a small group of whites believed and supported universal equality that included non-whites, but in spite of their efforts, they could not deliver that promise. And then the other is that nothing was supposed to come out of this that could come out of this because it was too fraught with too many problems that the politicians couldn't deliver. However, at the same time, Black agency made the desire to achieve this equality. And then for some during this period, Blacks did vote, and during Reconstruction, larger groups of Blacks achieved these rights. Yet, following the American Revolution and following Reconstruction, most of the rights were diminished until they were completely lost. And so my conclusion for you is that the legacy of the story, the legacy of America, is that equality cannot be legislated. It is a power struggle that is waged on multiple battlefields, but that it cannot be given, it has to be taken. And so that American history is really about groups of people working together to earn and achieve a goal. and that we are all together in America working to achieve this idea of universal equality. We all know that we don't have it yet, but we are all working together to achieve it. And that's really the legacy of American history, that regardless of race or gender or creed or identity, we all want that.